Hello, welcome to Life Matters. I'm your host, Brendan O'Connell. For more than 50 years as an attorney, an elected public official in California, as a state senator and a lieutenant governor, and as a private citizen, today's guest has been confronting the powerful sex industrial complex which produces and distributes pornography. He provides the evidence of how pornography ultimately destroys individuals, families, and societies. And our guest identifies large corporate entities that shamelessly exploit the unwary into an addiction to pornography and much, much more. Our guest sees pornography as an ominous cloud filtering into all aspects of our society. And we'll broach some of the topics in today's show and discuss his book, A Generation of Aliens. Well, welcome, John Harmer.
My honor. I'm happy to be with you, Brendan.
Mr. Harmer, what is the Lighted Candle Society and its purpose?
Please don't call me Mr. Harmer. My father was Mr. Harmer. Just call me John.
Okay.
As to the Lighted Candle Society, it's an organization that was formed 18 years ago in Washington, D.C. by the former Attorney General of the United States, Edwin Meese III, and myself. And our purpose in forming it was to be able to create a repository of scientific evidence of what pornography does to the individual, the family, the community, and ultimately the nation. And so from my office, I can see row after row of file cabinets filled with various reports reviewing what has been the real effect in our culture of its toleration of sexually explicit material.
Mm-hmm. And what do you mean in your book? It's entitled A Generation of Aliens. To me, that sounded like something from outer space, but it's not.
No, it's definitely not outer space. I almost wish it were. We chose the title, Brendan, because over the years, over the past 30 years, the average age of first exposure to pornography, and I'm going to refer to it as sexually explicit material because pornography has legal connotations that it's easier to deal with when you just say sexually explicit material. But 30 years ago, the average age that an individual really saw sexually explicit material was 15 or 16. And then a few years later, it dropped down to 13, and then it dropped down to 11. And Brandon, the latest national survey done by scientists at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, now says that the average age of first exposure to sexually explicit material is 9 years of age. Well, Brandon, one of the things that we've learned over the past few years with the study that we've done of the human brain is that the brain doesn't mature until an individual is in their mid-20s. It's a work in progress. And so when you have 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds being exposed to sexually explicit material, their brains are being altered in terms of function, in terms of structure. And that alteration is creating a generation of aliens, a generation very vastly different from their predecessors, a generation who do not have the same inhibitions about violence and similar things that we have. And so the purpose of the book, the purpose of the title, to answer your question, is that by virtue of our society's tolerance of sexually explicit material, we're raising a generation who are alien to the values and the principles that have been guiding their parents and their grandparents.
Well, now, you believe that sexually explicit material or pornography is an addiction that changes the brain. How so? Does it physically change the brain?
Well, as a matter of fact, not only our organization, the Lighted Candle Society, but the United States government and various other Western governments have now confirmed that what happens in the human brain with the repeated exposure to sexually explicit material is the same thing that happens when someone uses cocaine or other types of addictive drugs. The pathway in the brain that happens when the eyes see a sexually explicit image is the same pathway that happens when an individual becomes addicted to cocaine, heroin, etc. And so, yes, it is an addiction. It's a confirmed addiction by vastly significant scientific research.
Mm-hmm. Now, is there a need, people viewing pornography or sexually explicit material, is there an ever-increasing need for stimuli that goes beyond what they saw before?
Indeed, there is. In fact, that's one of the many tragedies involved in this situation. A person incrementally increases the graphic nature of the material, and the reason for that is because it is an addiction. The brain releases certain drugs that are produced by the brain for various health reasons in the human body. But when a person looks at pornography, the brain reacts to those drugs like it would if a mad dog was attacking you or you're about to have an automobile accident. The brain releases a cocktail of drugs, and that person gets a high. Well, after repeated efforts at that, the requirement to give them that high increases in terms of the nature of the material. They have to have increasingly more graphic, more severe material, which is why so much pornography also includes violence, sadomasochistic violence, which is violence involved with sexual activity. And yes, indeed, the history of people who become addicted to pornography is that it requires more and more graphic material for them to get the same cocktail released by their brain that causes the addiction.
What are some of those, when you say cocktail, is that like dopamine or something of that nature?
Yeah, there are 9 drugs, in fact, that are on this list, and sometimes this research is done in what's called an fMRI unit. That's that big donut that you see that doesn't emit radio waves. It uses magnetic energy to put a three-dimensional focus on an organ of the body. So by using functional magnetic resonance imagery, we can actually watch the brain in real time as it reacts to these images, which the scientists refer to as flight or fight, meaning that when the image comes through the eye to the brain, which takes less than 0.2 of a second, the brain's reaction is to fight or flight, either to run away or fight against it. But that flight or fight reaction is what releases dopamine and these 8 other drugs, which have legitimate life-saving purposes for the body, but which, when used in this way, create then an addiction that becomes devastating to the individual.
Mm-hmm. And are many teenagers subject to a daily diet of sex and violence?
Well, it's very difficult to give you a quantitative answer that can be documented, other than to say that many organizations which do the research on a grade school level, a junior high school level, a high school level, and a college level find that by the time the individual gets to college age, whether they're in college or not, in other words, they're 17 to 20 years old, that their frequency of seeking out the material is not only daily but several times a day in order to satisfy their craving.
Mm-hmm. And does the sex industry deny the link of pornography and violence? Would they deny that?
Oh yes, vociferously, just the way the tobacco industry for years and years denied that there was any link between smoking and lung cancer or other forms of cancer, even when they knew from their own research that such existed. But yes, the industry that is producing this is very well aware of it. In fact, they want the effect of an addiction because that means more money to them. The whole motivation in the production and distribution of sexually explicit material is money. And when you have an addict who will do anything to get cocaine or heroin or other types of mind-altering drugs, so an addict who is addicted to pornography will do the same thing. They have to have it. They have to see it. And so in the extreme cases, it drifts into very ugly, tragic types of addiction.
Mm-hmm. And how are women portrayed in pornographic material?
Women are portrayed as an object, not as a human being. They're portrayed as a sex object. And you particularly see this in the video games that are now so widely watched by young people. The depiction of a woman in a video game is as an object for gratification, not as a human being, not as someone who can be interpreted as a mentor, a nurturer, as a mother. And so, in fact, one of my arguments with the liberal women's movement is that the most anti-feminine thing in our country is pornography, but they refuse to join the fight against it.
I see. Now, you had a chapter on pornography and the death of the family, and how America got into this. I'll call it a pornographic morass. For instance, you mentioned mainstreaming academic research. Could you talk a little bit about that and some of the other points of how we were led down this path to a pornographic morass?
Well, I can answer your question most effectively by giving you an experience that I have repeatedly. I've given hundreds of talks to service clubs, parent-teacher associations, religious groups, etc., on this issue. And almost without exception, when my talk is over and the Q&A session is over and people are leaving, I'll see one or two women who will stay behind until everybody else is gone, and then they will cautiously approach me, and they'll say, I need to tell you my story. Well, my first reaction is, I already know your story. I've heard it 1,000 times, and I want you to know I'm not a therapist. I'm not trained as a therapist. I don't act as a therapist. I'm a trench warrior. But then they tell me their story, and the story almost always follows this script. There's an initial period of deceitfulness where the husband, and it's not always the husband, but let's assume it's the husband, is getting up at night to go to his computer, or he's staying late at the office to use his computer. Well, the getting up late at night or the staying late at the office is to use the computer to access pornographic sites. And this deceitfulness enters into then the relationship with the spouse, the relationship with the children, because the individual is hiding what he knows to be unacceptable behavior from the spouse and from the children. And Dr. Bryce Christensen, who is affiliated with the Howard Center in Illinois, has done a series of studies over the past 20 years of the cost to our society of its tolerance of pornography. And he factors into this analysis the cost of law enforcement, the cost of counseling, the cost of divorces, and now we've got a family that has to have government assistance. So you've got medical care, law enforcement, social costs, and his calculations now are that currently pornography is costing this country, in terms of those exceptional costs, over $25 billion a year. That's 25 billion with a B, because of the tolerance of our culture for this material.
Mm-hmm. And now I know you mentioned that some of Alfred Kinsey, and the decline of the family, and the U.S. Supreme Court, some of their decisions. Could you talk a little bit about that, how those things affected where we are today regarding pornography in the American society?
Yes, I certainly can, because my first involvement with the problem of pornography was in 1964. That's 61 years ago, when I was a young attorney in Los Angeles and was asked by the law enforcement people to assist in gathering evidence against a distributor of pornography. But in the period of the mid-50s, or late 40s, rather, actually the late 40s, an obscure professor of zoology at the University of Indiana wrote a book in which he alleged that over half of the married couples in America, were having promiscuous sexual activity outside of the marriage covenant. Researchers who have gone back to Kinsey's so-called research have proven that it was fraudulent, it was fabricated. Kinsey cited all sorts of things that he supposedly did, which has been determined he never did. He made up these things. But the media elevated Kinsey to an icon, so much so that he was, throughout the world, referred to as one of the great scientists of the 20th century, when he was, in fact, one of the great con men of the 20th century. But Kinsey created the sexual revolution, as we refer to it, and subsequent to Kinsey and his fraudulent material, you began to have the appearance in America of slick magazines, which were openly, graphically sexual, the advocacy in the media and the motion pictures and in the music of sexual promiscuity. And so this revolution in America of toleration of sexual promiscuity and then adherence to it began with this fraudulent material produced by Dr. Kinsey, a zoologist who never had any training in classical psychology, never. Anyway, from there, as the media endorsed and adopted more and more sexual explicitity, our culture turned more and more to adulation of sexual explicitity. And that, of course, then fed the market for the pornography industry, because you can only see so many advertisements of half-naked women till you want to see one of a totally naked woman. And so the availability of graphic, sexually explicit material became more and more extant, until finally now, because it has become so accepted in our society, there's now no criminal prosecution going on of the production of pornographic material, because our society is so tolerant of it. You can't impanel a jury that would give a conviction. You can't find 12 people who think that this material is abhorrent, even though it destroys individuals' lives. We have hundreds of records in our organization, accounts of men who've lost their job, their employment, because in the office, at work, they were so involved with, so addicted to this material, they weren't getting their job done. They had to be fired. And so you have families that lose their support. You have marriages that are broken apart. The cost to our culture of its tolerance of this material is just overwhelming.
Can I ask you, you said that there was 3 decisions made by, I believe, the U.S. Supreme Court. One was the Roth decision, another the Miller, and then the Lawrence versus Texas decision. How did those decisions devolve our society as it relates to pornography?
Well, the final decision in that series is called Miller versus California, in which the Supreme Court made the terrible mistake of first taking up the case at all. If the issue of pornography had been left to the states and not the federal government and the federal courts, you would at least have some semblance of resistance to it. But in Miller versus California, there was a 3-prong definition of what constitutes pornography. And the 3rd prong of these 3 is that the material to the average person, okay, first of all, you got to find an average person, that the material is patently offensive in terms of its presentation of graphically sexual material. We had a case being prepared in Atlanta, Georgia, where a 13-year-old girl was intentionally exposed to sexually explicit material by her father, and turned her into a neurotic person who needed months of expensive therapy in order to bring her back to childhood. But my point is that as we prepared a lawsuit on that particular situation, as we made research in the suburbs of Atlanta to see whether or not the average person would regard this material as pornography, we learned that it would not be possible to impanel a jury where you could find 8 to 10 people who would regard this material, which was a combination of violence and sexual explicitness, sexual conduct, who would regard it as pornography. The tolerance of our society had moved so far to the extreme that the Miller decision, which was handed down in 1973, is irrelevant. And so there is no prosecution of pornography now, because you can't find a jury where a majority of the people will find sexually explicit material involving violence and rape, etc., who would still find it patently offensive to contemporary community standards.
Mm-hmm. And now, how does the sex industrial complex actually work? Well,
it's a part of the worldwide net, in that when 61 years ago, I was a part of that prosecution in Los Angeles. The material was being printed in the United States. It was being distributed in the United States. And now you have the ability from anywhere in the world to transmit this information. And so you have many of the world's largest banks who openly finance producers and distributors of pornography, because the revenue, the cash revenue using credit cards is so extensive, the money going in. So you have a combination of the media, the financial institutions, and even governments in some countries, where the government actively promotes the production of this material because of the revenue in the country. You have what we call the sex industrial complex. It's a business. It's a huge business. Several very, very well-documented studies have determined that worldwide the business of sexual materials is now close to $100 billion per year.
Wow, that's something.
$100 billion
John,
per
one
year.
final question. Our time is short. Porn and crimes against children, are they underreported as far as crimes against children and pornography?
Absolutely. The best estimate we can get is that only 1 out of 5 crimes against children are actually reported. And for rape, it's actually 1 out of 9. In other words, you got, for every woman who actually complains of having been raped, there were 8 other women who were raped, but who, because they just don't want to endure the misery of having to relive the experience, don't report it, don't tell what had happened. And we get this from rapists who are been caught, prosecuted, incarcerated, who will openly say, well, yes, I did it, and in fact I did it to 25, 30 other women who never reported it.
Well, John, I have lots of other questions to ask, but our time has come to an end, unfortunately. But I really appreciate your insights. This is the first time we've done a show on this topic, and it needs to be explored more fully. Thank you so much for the work that you've done over the decades, and hopefully folks will get a copy of your book, too, A Generation of Surveillance. Well, we hope you found today's show to be a unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. Thanks for watching. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life.